I press it because I've had a few where I just didn't have the settings right and got all messed up, and so I was like, let's hope I have the settings right.
Yeah.
All right. How's your week been? Anything interesting happen?
My week is pretty interesting. I don't know. I think I told you I was traveling, and so I was in Israel for a few weeks.
Oh
And
wow.
so we had some fireworks. We had a very explosive time in Israel. I mean, I have a lot of family in Israel. I have a few children in Israel, and so we had a good family time. But it was, despite the troubles and tribulations and the missiles and the sirens and all of the conflict, we were able to have a good time. We ended up staying longer because the airport was closed because of the missiles coming from Gaza. So we ended up staying a little bit longer. So I just got back a few days ago. But I'm teaching in the summer at Bellarmine online. So I started an intro philosophy course this past week. So I've been pretty busy.
Is Bellarmine a school in Israel?
No, no, Bellarmine is here in Louisville,
Gotcha.
right? Yeah. So I'm just saying that I started a summer session this week just as I got back.
Oh, cool. So, to give my little introduction, Dr. Josh, thank you for coming on my show and taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. So I'll tell you, my background is I grew up in a Jewish home. I grew up as what you might call a modern Orthodox Jewish home. Um, I can explain that if there's any question about that, but pretty traditional religious Jewish home. Plus, my father also happened to be a professor of philosophy. My father, who passed away just this past year, Martin Golding, he was a professor for a long time at Columbia and Duke University, and his specialty was actually philosophy of law. So he was pretty well known in philosophy of law. Anyway, I had a traditional, Jewish education, went to Jewish day schools, but I also had a relatively early introduction to philosophy when I was in high school. So I got very interested in philosophy. And when I was in high school and I went to Columbia University for college, majored in philosophy. And I also continued my Jewish studies and wrestled a lot with doubt, with philosophical issues, questions about faith, God, evil, why believe in God? Should I believe in God? Went through a lot of periods of doubt and belief. And eventually, I continued on in graduate school and got very interested in other things in philosophy of religion, and in particular, Pascal's wager, which I think I know you want to talk a little bit about. And I ended up writing, well, if I could just show this book that I wrote. Okay, this book, Rationality and Religious Theism, this was published in 2003. I had a fellowship at Notre Dame University, and I wrote this book. This is kind of like it's a critique, but also a sort of attempt to give a revised version of Pascal's wager. And then later on, I just wanted to, you asked me to introduce myself. So this book called The Conversation, this is a rather large book. It's over 400 pages. This book is a sort of philosophical novel. It's about a college who spends 4 years in college, and through the course of the 4 years explores various issues, problems, questions having to do with character is Jewish, but not from a very strong Jewish background, but explores. It's a way of sort of exploring through, in a philosophical novel form, many of the issues that someone who's a college student, more or less, interested in religion and questions about God might explore. And then most recently, this is the most recent book I have is called The Jewish Spiritual Path, The Way of the Name. And in this, I try to sort of give a philosophically, I would like to say a philosophically sophisticated version of the Jewish spiritual path according to traditional Jewish teachings, and also incorporating some ideas from the Kabbalah, which is the Jewish mystical tradition. I don't know if Tom, how familiar you are perhaps with that or not, but in any event, this is my most recent book. So I've written several articles having to do with questions of faith and commitment, and written several different articles on Pascal's wager. Some very critical, some more kind of defending the wager approach. And I've written a few other things in Jewish philosophy, but yeah, that's, as I said, I went through periods of doubt, especially when I was younger, and I still have some degree of doubt, but I consider myself to be a devout religious believer, particularly in traditional Judaism.
Cool.
And I
So
live in Louisville, Kentucky. I teach philosophy. I've been at Bellarmine for 30 years.
awesome.
So, and I have a beautiful family, wife and kids, and now I have a grandkid. So that's me.
Exciting. Busy life. Have a grandkid, new grandkids for sure. So I'm an atheist, by which I mean I believe that naturalism best explains all the different evidences that we see, and so I don't think that any of them actually indicate a God. Uh, Pascal's wager specifically, I don't understand how Pascal's wager could be evidence for God because I don't see any difference in probability between the belief, if you believe in a God, going to heaven versus not believing in a God. That counter belief seems to have equal probability to get you into heaven. So I don't see how belief in a God would actually tip the scales in the favor of a God. Could you explain more about your position on Pascal's wager?
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's a very good criticism of Pascal's wager as such. In my book, I try to argue, among other things. I mean, I think there are several problems with Pascal's wager, and one of the problems that you're pointing to is trying to substantiate or evidentiate in some way the link between a certain belief and a certain end or goal, right? And so, in Pascal's wager, in its original form, there doesn't seem to be like any reason given for why a belief in God would connect necessarily with an infinite payoff, right? So one of the ways I've tried to articulate, you could look at this as a defense of Pascal's wager or as a revision of Pascal's wager, and that is that the ultimate good that the religious person is seeking is God Himself, or itself, or herself, if you prefer. Okay, in other words, God is conceived as the best supreme, right? That's the idea of God, is the idea of if you wish, the best possible being, the greatest being of all possible beings, right? That than which none greater can be conceived, as Anselm described it. So, okay, so then the question is, well, let's suppose we're in a position where we don't know whether this being exists or doesn't exist, okay? But this is the best possible being, all right? And the idea is that now not everyone is going to find this plausible, but I do think that it is rationally defensible for someone to think plausibly that having some relationship with this best possible being would be the best possible state for me to be in. In other words, I mean, maybe a simpler way of thinking about it is if there is a supreme being, right? The supreme being would be the most powerful and the best being that is possible, right? And so therefore, if that infinite, essentially God is the infinite good, right? People think of heaven as sort of something that, well, maybe God's going to give you a reward, if you're going to be a good guy, or you're going to be a Christian, or whatever it is, you're going to be some person who does certain things, you're going to then somehow get this reward from God. But traditional, religious people, Christians, Muslims, Jews, the ultimate good is God Himself. Okay, so that's number one. I mean, that's only part of the answer to your question, I believe. Okay, in other words, don't think about heaven as some kind of reward that God gives you, but rather think about God as the ultimate good. God is the good that we're trying to get as religious seekers. Okay. Now, the next step I would say is that the way I try to work out a revision, if you will, of Pascal's wager is to argue that it is eminently rational or at least rationally defensible for someone to pursue the greatest possible good, even in the face of doubt about whether that good is actually attainable at all. Okay. Because to pursue it, to pursue that good. Okay. Now, how are we going to pursue that ultimate good? Well, that's going to depend on, your conception of the best possible being. And traditionally, of course, God is conceived as as a being who is both loving and who is a morally, if you will, superior being. I mean, there might be some problems with that. The idea is that, as I work out in my book, that it's Pascal's wager. He tries to justify a belief in God, right? And my approach is to say, let's not try to justify a belief in God using this pragmatic approach. Let's try to justify the pursuit of a relationship with this best possible being. And I think that that is reasonable, all right? Now, if you're going to pursue some being or pursue a relationship with a being that you're not sure whether it exists or not, you're going to have to make what I call a pragmatic assumption. Okay, pragmatic assumption is, I think we make pragmatic assumptions all the time in life. We don't necessarily know, or maybe we might have very little confidence that a certain state of affairs is true, but we assume it because there's some kind of great value that we conceive of being at stake if that state of affairs turns out to be true. And it makes sense. It's rational to pursue certain ends if they are understood as very valuable, even in the face of doubt about whether we're. Okay, so now you still might, I'm going on and on too long here. You probably want to jump in here and ask a bunch of questions, but a little more piece to finish this off is that if we conceive of God as a supreme being, and we conceive of God as something like a person, which is what monotheism does, right? Monotheism conceives of God along the line. I mean, as the Bible says, if you don't mind, if I quote the Bible here, that it's just for the sake of, what the concept of God is. God, the human being is created in the image of God, right? So traditional think of God as a being who is in some way like a person. And so the best possible relationship with God would be something like an interpersonal relationship with God. All right. So the bottom line is to sort of summarize what I've been saying is that it may not be rational to believe, just belief alone is not necessarily going to make it more likely that you gain this relationship with God, but it's the pursuit of the relationship with God. I'm going to try to do as a devout person. I'll speak somewhat personally, if you don't mind. I'm going to try to pursue that relationship as hard as I can, even in the face of doubt. And that means meditating. That means engaging in prayer. That means trying to do what I think is the most likely, trying to do those actions that I think are the most likely ones of all available options to get to that end, to get to that goal. And that goal might not take place in this world. It might take place in the next world. Conceivably, I think that someone who engages in the spiritual path is looking for a relationship with God in this world. And people who do that find it incredibly rich and meaningful. And that's already, I think, what I wanted to say was, and maybe I'm saying too much. I should let you talk. But I'll say one more thing and then I'll be quiet and let you speak. That I think ultimately a pragmatic argument needs to be combined with some kind of a spiritual experience argument. I know you've talked maybe about this in some of your other interviews with other professors or other religious folks, thinkers, right? That I think that the pragmatic argument that I'm endorsing ultimately really needs some kind of a experiential element to make it really work. So the pragmatic argument sort of gets you on the path. It makes sense to a relationship with God, even if you're in doubt. And then once you start undergoing a religious path, you find maybe you don't. You know, some people start becoming religious and they don't feel anything. They can't, you know, it doesn't turn them on, if you so to speak. And then they give it up. And in a way, I'd say that, well, you know, that's what they've decided, that makes sense for them. But for someone who pursues the religious path and finds it to be enriching and deep and makes valuable and meaningful, it's a very powerful reason for continuing, even in the face of doubt about, well, maybe God doesn't really exist after all, so I'm wasting my time.
So, how would
Sorry I've
you?
gone on for so
Oh
long.
no, it's perfectly fine. So, how would you rephrase, like in a premise conclusion kind of a format, Pascal's wager in what you're trying to argue for? Because it seems like Pascal's wager is saying, here's a reason to believe in a God, even if you have no evidence. Whereas it seems yours is more, here's a reason to do actions that you think would lead to getting the reward in heaven, whether or not there's a, or what you believe a God to be, whether or
Right.
not you know it.
Yeah, I would say that. Yeah, I think you're on the right track there. Understanding it's like it's a rationale for pursuing certain kinds of actions that will hopefully get me. Again, you use the term reward, and I understand that, but I want to have this relationship with God. That doesn't mean I don't want other things in life and that I don't care about relationships with human beings and so on and so forth. But the claim here is that it makes sense. It's rational for me to pursue this end, and I do believe maybe this is a better way, that there is a rational way of distinguishing which actions are more likely versus which actions are less likely to get me into the best possible relationship with the best possible being as I understand that being. So
That,
for
that part I think would be is interesting. So, what is the way that we can use to distinguish between which actions are more or less likely to get us that relationship?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, I talk about that in my book. I try to articulate that. Again, if we conceive of if you know if we conceive of the best possible being as in some sense a person, okay. Now it may that could be a whole nother like discussion. What do you mean? Well, how is God a person? What does that mean, right? But let's just take for granted the notion that in some sense the best possible being is um, some kind of a supreme rational agent. Okay. Um, so that means that being is intelligent, right? That means that being has some kind of has agency, right? That means that maybe if God is a person of some sort, I would think that I have a better shot of attaining the best relationship with God if I if I pray than if I don't pray. That's an example. Okay. If I seek God, how do you seek God, right? I mean, different religious traditions have different paths, but there's actually a lot of similarity among the monotheistic ones. Like if you take Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, and I'm not saying there aren't other forms of monotheism, but they all endorse prayer, and they all endorse, generally speaking, they endorse being a good human being, right? I mean, I think that makes sense. If I'm going to have a relationship with the best possible being, then I can't be going around doing nasty, evil things. So I got to live a moral life. I mean, living a moral life might be valuable in and of itself. I actually, this is a bit of a tangent. There's some people who think, and I disagree with this, but there are some religious people who think that if God doesn't exist, then everything is kind of meaningless, that there's no meaning in life. I'm sure you've come across this view, right?
Sure.
That, that if God doesn't exist, basically, as Dostoevsky said in one of his books, or was a character, if there is no God, then everything is permitted. I don't think that that's true. I think that even if I were to come to the conclusion that God, as I understand, does not exist, I would not say that therefore life becomes meaningless or I just kind of do whatever the hell I want to do. There's no such thing as doing the right thing. I mean, I don't know what your views are about morality and such. If you're a subjectivist or a hedonist, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm a moral realist. I have an objective model of morality
You
also.
are. You are. Okay. So good. So then we agree on something there. Um, I think that I think moral objectivism does not depend on the existence of God. However, I think that life is meaningful or can be meaningful, very meaningful, even without a God. I think that if there is a God, then life can be very extraordinarily meaningful. Whereas if there's no God, then that's not available and life can't be quite as meaningful as it would be if there is a God. I'm sorry, I forgot, sort of, I lost the train of thought here about how we got onto that. But
Yeah,
what
yeah, sure. Let
basically,
me.
okay, just going back to the train of thought, I just one more sentence that I think that there is a rational way to determine. So living a moral life, that's what I was saying, being a decent human being, being a good person. Now, I think that if God is a person, one would expect that not only can God hear prayer, but also God can speak, God can communicate. So one would be inclined to look around and see if there's any reports of revelation about what God has said. Now, I know there's a lot of skeptical problems about how do you determine whether a revelation is or is not, really genuinely coming from God. But Judaism is certainly a major candidate, um, especially for someone who's brought up as a religious Jew, or someone who is a Jewish person. There's a very strong candidate out there for if God has revealed Himself, this this looks like it might be a good candidate for what that would look like. Now, that doesn't prove that it's true. It doesn't even prove that it's more likely than not likely to be true. But if I'm looking for a relationship with the best possible being, and I conceive of God as a person and intelligent and capable of in some way communicating in words, well, we've been around here for, I don't know how many years, human beings. Um, one would think that by now God would have, if God does exist, God would have communicated with somebody. And well, there's a tradition of revelation. So to me, that's a candidate. Now, I might be wrong. Maybe Christianity is another candidate. Islam's another candidate. Maybe none of them are right. But so to speak, going back to Pascal's wager a little bit, is I'm going to bet on the best horse that I can find.
Yeah, so we just got a super chat from Raw Nakedness. Isn't your definition of good a tautology there? So it seems like this is the same direction I was going to be going in, is that
Okay.
if you have a preconception about what you assume God to be like, well, then obviously you should do the things that you think would be like that God. So, like, if I thought God was nature, I should take care of nature. If I thought God was a potato, I should do potato farming.
Right.
So, doesn't the
Do
fact
you think do you think the best possible being is a potato?
I think that it's equally as likely as our definition that Christians use that God is a maximally great being. I think that that definition is arbitrary. I think that when
Okay.
I think of what a maximally great being would be in my worldview, it would be like a quantum field or something. I think that the fundamental nature of reality is a quantum field, and that is what is.
That's the best possible being that you can conceive of, or that's the best possible being that you think actually exists?
I think that's the most fundamental thing that exists. I think best and greatness are
Mhm.
arbitrary concepts made up by humans. I don't think there's like an actual
So you do
measure.
sound like you're a subjectivist or a relativist. I thought you were an objectivist.
For greatness, yes. For greatness, I think it's like chairness or Bachness or something, just some made up human concept. I obviously think there's a moral goodness to the world, but I think that would be a law of nature like gravity or any other law of nature. I don't think there is some actual greatness property that exists in things. Like, I don't think we can measure the greatness between my chair and my guitar.
Well, I mean, I'm tempted to respond to that in two very different ways, and there wouldn't be enough time to articulate both of them completely. But let me just trot out a couple of different possibilities. I mean, one way of discuss this a little bit in my book, that there are those who think that there's no rational way to establish, no non-arbitrary rational way to establish that a certain way of thinking about the best being is the right one. Isn't that in effect kind of what you're saying? That there's no that it's arbitrary if we were to sit here and try to argue about which is the best possible being, and you said the best possible being is a potato, and I said the best possible being is a creature that has will and intent and intelligence. There's no way of rationally determining who's right. Is that what? Yeah.
Yes, partially, but
Okay. So
I'm going a little bit deeper than that. I'm saying that
okay.
not just that we can't determine who's right, but that we can't determine that greatness itself is a property that exists. So, like if I said, like, what is the comfiest chair? Like that isn't a property in the universe that exists independent of human minds. It's just something humans made up. So
Mm-hmm.
first you'd have to establish that this greatness property is a real thing in reality, like spin or mass or charge or momentum. And then you would have to say, even if we could prove that it was real, then you would also need a way to demonstrate that one is more likely, more one definition is more likely to be true than another.
But I mean, I guess, like I said, I was trying to say there's two ways I would try to respond to that. Is to try to articulate a defense of what I would call an objectivist perspective on what would make one being better than another being. Okay. Um, so, for example, I would say that if I'm comparing two beings and I'm trying to think about which one is a better being than the other being, um, then I would argue that an infinite, eternal, everlasting, necessary being is a better being than one that is contingent and mortal and finite. It's got a better quality of being than a being that stops being after a while.
Well, what do you mean by quality of being there? Because from my perspective, I think that being's better. In my opinion, that would be better to be that
Okay.
being.
Well, mm-hmm.
But my opinion isn't a quality of the universe. It's not like there's
Well,
mass that I can determine that
or,
exists independently of my opinion there. It's just my opinion. So obviously I would agree with you. I think I would prefer to be this kind of ultimate being, but that doesn't mean that that beingness itself is a thing that exists.
I guess I don't think that that really matters to the argument then. I guess that flips me over to my other approach was to say, let's just be subjectivists, or maybe that's not the right term for your view about this, but if I think, let's suppose I just happen to think that, let me try to this. If I, let's suppose I happen to think that human beings are better to have a relationship with than cockroaches. Something I happen to believe is true. Okay, I mean, I'm not against cockroaches. I don't have, the desire to go around killing cockroaches, but I would rather spend, an afternoon with a human being, having a conversation, maybe making love, perhaps, or something like that, having a drink, having this wonderful conversation, than, let's say, having a relationship with a cockroach, playing around with a cockroach. I mean, let's suppose we just say, well, that's just your opinion. You feel like that. Maybe somebody else would rather spend their afternoon with a cockroach than a human being. Well, I would rather spend my life, or I would rather spend have a relationship with a human being than a cockroach. Now, let's suppose I can't establish rationally that humans are actually objectively superior to cockroaches. I actually think there is a way of doing that, but I'm not going to try to do that now, because I think that's hard to do and very complicated. But okay, let's suppose I'm just I'm such subjectivist about thinking that I'd rather have a relationship with a cockroach than a I'm sorry, backwards. Relationship with a human being than a cockroach. Okay, actually, it might depend on the human being, because for some human beings, I'd rather stick with the cockroach. But okay, so now let's say I think to myself, okay, let's suppose I'm in some place where There's no all the only thing around me are cockroaches. There's no human beings. And I get some kind of vague, you know, evidence, some kind of very scanty evidence that there actually is a human being out there somewhere. Let's say I'm on a deserted island, and I find there's some scanty evidence that maybe there's another human being somewhere on this island. And I say to myself, well, you know, I just value that so much. It makes sense for me to try to link up with this other human. So you see where I'm going with this, right? In other words,
Oh yeah.
I agree that, you know, you want to say that greatness is not an objective property, or you want to say it's subjective. It doesn't matter to the argument, because for me, now again, there's a value, you know, any pragmatic argument, there's some kind of a belief or a conception of being valuable. And there's a big argument in philosophy about whether values can be rationally substantiated, right? Or whether they're subjective or whether they're concocted. But what difference does it make to the argument that it's still, if I conceive of this value as if I conceive of a certain being as having what I would think is a great value, and having a relationship with that being as having a very supreme value for me, then it makes sense for me to pursue it, even in the face of doubt about whether it exists.
Oh, absolutely. I'm totally fine with the logic there, but the logic there seems to be
Mhm.
kind of self-referential, a little bit circular. Like if all there were around me were humans, and I thought that a superior relationship would be with cockroaches, which is actually a thing. So people with autism, Asperger's syndrome, which I have special interests, and they value certain particular activities more than relationships with humans. So for that
Okay.
person, they can say, well,
Yeah.
I think that a relationship with cockroaches would be better than with humans, and I don't know of any cockroaches, but I believe they're out there. For that person, it would be
Yes.
rational
Yeah.
to take the actions to be like a cockroach. In the same way, for you, it would be rational to take the actions to believe in a God. So it seems like the argument is simply saying it's rational for you to do what you believe makes you happy, or will make you, or lead to the reward of some kind, the positive outcome.
Um, I guess maybe in a way that's true. Yeah, I'm okay with that. If I mean, I would try to, I guess, articulate more why it is that it makes sense to think of the best possible being as having a certain set of qualities, um, eternity, infinity, you know, being eternal, infinite, all powerful, um, and maybe some people are not going to find that convincing, are not going to find that attractive in some way. And so they're going to say, well, even if there is this being, I'm still not going to bother pursuing a relationship with it because I don't find that to be something that floats my boat. Yeah. So I guess I'm not sure I really disagree with what you're saying. I guess I don't see it as a flaw. I see it as a, yeah, that's that's the way it is.
Well, the flaw I would say is that
Yeah.
because it's self-referential, it's essentially saying it's rational for you to do what you already believe, regardless of whether or not the truth of what you actually believe is taken into account. So, like, if I,
Well, okay. Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm interrupting. Go
oh, no,
ahead.
that's fine. So yeah, the point is that in any circular argument, the same circular argument can be applied to any perspective or worldview, and say it's justified based off whatever you happen to insert noun into that worldview.
Okay, I guess I think that's a little bit unfair to the argument. I mean, you know, there are some people who would say that all arguments ultimately ultimately in some way are circular, especially if they're about such, you know, profound things. It's hard to in a way when you're trying to justify a worldview, how do you justify a worldview without in some way coming around to using premises from the worldview itself? Um, But I think that I guess what I would want to say is, I think that there are a lot of people out there, and you may not be one of them, but I think there are a lot of people out there who do conceive of God as monotheism does, and who do conceive of a certain kind of relationship with that God as being an ultimately like supreme best possible state, but they don't put the steps together, and therefore they end up saying is, well, but I don't think there's evidence for that kind of God, so therefore I'm giving it up. And so they would be engaged in some kind of form of irrationality, wouldn't they? According to me, anyway. Uh, I think that ultimate commitments, our ultimate values, you might say, are ultimately very, very hard to justify for anyone. So I guess I'm not seeing the I'm not seeing either. I'm not seeing the circularity, or I'm not seeing why that particular circularity is pernicious.
Yeah, you can make the argument that any philosophical, just deductive argument would be circular in some sense. But I think this one is more of the viciously circular type because it's just saying essentially that you're justified in acting upon the things you already believe. But it doesn't give a justification for if your beliefs happen to be true or not. So I think that in order to make it a non viciously circular argument, you need to say it's justified or rational to act on your beliefs if those beliefs you have some reason to believe they correspond to reality. Like, for example, if I just came up with the belief the cockroach God is real, and I just like, or I shook a magic 8-ball, like a dice or whatever, and it just came up with the idea the cockroach God is real, even if I believed that, and because I believed it, it would therefore be rational to act in accordance with my beliefs, that doesn't mean the belief itself is rational. So I think that for it to be rational to act on the beliefs, you would first have to demonstrate the belief itself is rational, because if you came to that belief from an irrational or unjustified way, then even though logically you could say that because you believe this, it may be rational to follow the tenets of the beliefs, it
Yeah,
would be irrational because you came to those beliefs themselves in an irrational way.
right. Well, I guess what you're in a way what you're asking for is for me to try to go back to that other approach that I tried to articulate first, which I think is harder to do. I grant that there is some way of that the conception of that there is a rational way to determine what a best possible being would be like. That's not an arbitrary endeavor or process.
Oh yeah, that's definitely a part of it. But the my question here is that it seems all your argument is doing is it's taking the beliefs you already hold and then just saying it's rational to act in accordance with those beliefs. Whereas I would think that is a conditional statement. It's only rational to act in accordance with these beliefs if those beliefs have some kind of justification. Whereas your argument doesn't seem to add that caveat. It just says it is always rational to act in accordance with your beliefs without any consideration to the previous acquiring of those beliefs. And so it seems because your argument only considers the rationality to act in accordance with your beliefs, that seems to be viciously circular because if you came to those beliefs in an irrational way, your argument still holds.
I guess I think that the beliefs upon which this argument depend are rationally defensible. They may not be beliefs that I could, um, give a rationally knockdown, drag out argument for. I think it is rational to think that a generally speaking, that a person is better than a non-person as a being.
Right. I'm that's
Maybe you disagree with
I
that.
just want to jump in for a minute.
So,
I'm totally fine with that, but my
so what?
objection to your argument
Yeah,
is that if someone had an irrational belief, could they
right.
use your argument to justify in acting in accordance with their irrational belief? And it seems like from the definition you gave, like yes, they could, because the only part of your argument is that it's rational to act in accordance with your beliefs. And since that is the full structure of your argument and it doesn't include any caveat about whether or not it requires the beliefs themselves to be rational, then someone with an
Well,
irrational belief
mhm.
could use your argument to justify their irrational behavior. And that, I think, is the problem with your argument, that it seems to me, because it's circular.
Okay, I guess what my I didn't think that my argument was saying that it's rational to engage in whatever your belief system endorses or something like that. The structure of the argument is that if you have a certain conception of God and a certain conception of what a good relationship with God would look like, that I mean, I talk about this in the book. So I mean, maybe this would address part of the problem. I try to articulate the notion that a certain conception of God is rationally plausible. That doesn't mean everyone's going to agree with it. Okay. A certain conception of a good relationship with God makes sense. It's rationally plausible. It doesn't mean everyone's going to agree with it. And given those conceptions about what would be a supremely valuable supreme being and what would be the best possible relationship with that being, okay, then then you also need to substantiate in some way that certain ways of acting, certain sets of actions are going to be more plausibly connected with the attainment of that relationship with God, right? So someone might have uh, false beliefs, or even from their own point of view, they might have mistaken beliefs about what they think is the route or the path to a relationship with God. I mean, someone might conceivably think that running around the block 17 times every day is going to maximize their relationship with the best possible being. Someone might think that, and then the question would be, why do you think that? Or so I think that um, they're critiquing what is your religious path. I think that that is path toward the best possible being. How do you think about the best possible being? I think that those are conversations that people can have that are that are not arbitrary.
So
Uh,
there would be a caveat in your argument that it says it's rational to act in accordance with your beliefs about God if your beliefs about God something. There's something about them that has to, some criteria it has to meet. And if it meets this criteria, then it's rational to act in accordance with your
right.
beliefs.
For example, I mean, I think that there are some ways of thinking about God that might be incoherent, like literally incoherent, like inconsistent and
God is a
unformed.
square circle.
You're right. Right. So we don't, if God is a square circle, we don't want to bother with pursuing a relationship with God because that's not going to happen. Um,
Well, but is your only criterion that it doesn't entail a logical contradiction? Because
um, no, I mean, I think that, like I said before, that I think that there are, uh, I think that there are rational ways of trying to support one way of thinking about God versus another way. I think that an infinite, eternal being who is independent and necessary, I think I think it's rational to say that that being would be a better being than a contingent and mortal one. Better being has a better level. We've talked about this before, and I went in the other direction of trying to accept your sort of subjectivist approach. Oh, I think it's subjectivist. Maybe that's maybe you're saying no, that's not going to work.
yeah, but that's totally correct.
Mhm.
So I would take a subjectivist approach to the greatness property, not the moral property. The morality, I think, is fine, but greatness, I think, is not. Greatness, I think, is purely subjective, made up by humans. So I'd say that any
Mm.
definition of greatness would be like the definition of the comfiest chair. Like, I think it needs to have a leg rest. I think it needs to have four legs. I think it
Mhm.
needs to be made of leather or suede. It's just a subjectivist approach. So it seems like
Right.
any particular person's definition of greatness is essentially just made up by them. I think this is the
Okay.
greatest
Well, I
possible
think
being.
yeah. I mean, if you want to pursue that a little bit, I mean, my argument there would be that we have to think about what would make one being a better being than another being, not what would make one entity, more comfy than another.
Well, doesn't that beg the question? Because we're asking, what is it that makes something better? What is the betterness quality itself? Asking,
We
well,
have to
what is
think
the
about,
better?
well, we have to think about being itself, right?
Sure, but I'm asking, like, what is betterness? Is betterness a real thing, or is betterness a human made up concept? And asking, well, which being is better? Well, you're already including better in your argument. Like, we want to know, why should we think betterness is a real thing first?
Um, I don't know if it matters if it's a real thing or not a real thing. The issue is if you take two beings, if you compare two beings, one of which is contingent and mortal, and the other of which is eternal and necessary, which entity has a greater quality of being? The one that has being but then stops being basically has a defect in its being because it stops.
Well, to me, it seems like you've said there is this better quality of being property, which I'm just call this the greatness property.
Yeah,
And this greatness property exists. This one being has less of it than this other being. This is a real thing that exists in reality. It's not just it's like mass or energy or momentum. One has more than the other. It's a real thing as opposed to comfiness. Comfiness is not a real thing. The chair, it's not like the chair doesn't have the comfiness property anywhere in it. It's something we've made up. So
well, I mean, okay, I'm sorry. I mean, it one chair is more comfy to you than another. That's
right.
real.
Sure.
That's real.
But if we want to say that there is some property in reality that the greater
Uh-huh.
being exists in some sense because it's greater, then the greater property has to be instantiated not by my opinion, because obviously if I just imagine
Yeah.
something that's greater, it's not going to exist because of my imagination, but it has to exist because there's this quality of greatness in the universe that makes it exist. And if it's just a human made up concept, then there wouldn't be a reason to infer that because we define something as greater, that it therefore exists.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, again, I'm not sure that that matters to the argument. I think that what I'm trying to say is that there is a rational of distinguishing between one the between what makes one being a better being insofar as it is a being. I mean, we can talk about things being heavier than others, or I guess, or things being longer than others, or things being bigger than others. Presumably, you would agree that is that a real quality for you? That
Sure,
one thing
bigger
is
like
bigger,
size, mass, space, those are
bigger
all real
size mass,
properties. Sure.
right? Okay, so if one being is eternal or necessary, independent, and I would add, by the way, free, because I think freedom is also something that makes a being a better being than a being that is not free. So for me, whether you call whether you say that being greater is really in the world or is really in your mind, the fact is that a being that's eternal, necessary, and free is it's rational to regard that as a better being than a being that's mortal and contingent. Better in its being. I don't know. Maybe I'm just repeating myself. We're not getting anywhere with this, but I think that is objectively rational to make those distinctions. Uh, so,
Well, I mean, because the way I hear it
but
is
now that
like,
doesn't mean that this great being exists, right? That's another
right,
question.
right.
Right?
Yeah. So I'm not arguing about the existence of the being itself. I'm asking
Okay.
about the existence of the property itself that you were ascribing to
Mhm.
the being. So, like, if I said it's more rational to believe Captain Kirk is more Klingon than Harry Potter. Now, if I said that's rational to believe, like that seems weird to me because there's no property of Klingon. That's literally not a thing. We've completely made that up. It's made up by a human being. So to think
Mhm.
that this made up property of Klingonness is a real thing somewhere in the universe doesn't seem to be coherent. It seems irrational for me to apply this property, which doesn't have any basis other than imagination, to things in reality. It seems like until we can demonstrate there is such a property, then we can't just ascribe it to things and say it's rational to believe that this thing has this property. So when we're talking about greatness or greaterness of being of some kind, for it to be objectively greater, there has to be some kind of objective greatness property. And if there's not, then it's no different from saying Harry Potter is the better wizard. There's no such thing as a property of wizard, so it doesn't make any sense to say anything has that property.
I don't know. I guess I'm not sure what to say. I mean, I'm not sure I agree with you there. Um, that it wouldn't make sense in some way to say that. Well, yeah, I mean, we know that Harry Potter and these other figures, the Klingons, they're fictional characters, which brings up a whole nother, I think,
Right. We can like say you are the
topic.
better wizard. You are the better wizard than me, or you are
Mhm.
more Klingon than me. The properties of Klingon and wizard, as they are made up properties, doesn't seem to be rational to hold the position that you are a better Klingon or a better wizard than me, because we don't actually have any way to establish those are real properties. So it seems irrational to conclude you are a better Klingon because we haven't shown. There's no rational reason to conclude Klingonness is real.
Hmm. I don't know. I'd have to think about that.
That's fine. So we had a super chat from Dustin. He asks, "Would a
Yes.
perfect being create imperfect beings like humans, and would that contradict his perfectness?"
Okay. I mean, that's a good theological question. That I think the traditional monotheists would say that a perfect being. I mean, I think that traditional monotheistic theology would say that God is perfect, right? So God cannot even. There's certain things God can't do, right? I mean, there's a debate about that, but most Western theologians would agree that there are certain things that God can't do. And one of the things God can't do is create a being that is just like himself. God is necessary and eternal, and in that sense, that's part of God's perfection. And so, therefore, unfortunately, God is bound by His own perfection. He can't create anything other than something that is in some way imperfect. But rather than create nothing at all, He can create things that are imperfect. And I think traditional, Judaism, Christianity, Islam to some degree, I think the picture is that, well, this perfect being creates a world which is imperfect, and the goal is that, among other things, human beings are here to elevate the world and bring the world to the best possible state that it can be. So it's going to be as perfect as it can be. Traditional Judaism says that there will come a day when the world has reached a sort of more complete, full state, but it's still not going to be identical with God Himself.
I guess that makes sense. Yeah. So like, God, if God Himself is perfect and He's just giving properties to other things that aren't Him, He's just some combination of other things. I guess that would make sense if you define God as perfect and He's not making Himself. Everything is then therefore imperfect.
Right? It would seem so.
Yeah. So my last question was,
Sure.
if I said, "Is it rational for me to believe you are more Klingon than I am?" And the answer would seem to be no. In order for it to be rational to believe that, we would first need to show Klingonness is a real thing. And so it seems to me the same kind of rationality would apply to believing God is the greatest possible being. Like, even if we grant God existed, to say God is greater than my chair or something, it would be equally as irrational to say God is the better Klingon than my chair, because Klingonness is a made up human property, as to say God is a greater being than my chair, unless we can show this greatness thing as a real property of some kind, unlike the Klingonness. Or would you disagree?
Yeah, I guess I am disagreeing about. I'm not sure about the Klingon example, but I'm more confident about what I want to say about the notion that some beings are better beings than others. I think that human beings are better beings than, I don't want to pick on cockroaches again, chairs, trees. I think trees are wonderful, but I think humans are better. I think they're um, intrinsically better as beings because their level of being, so to speak, is. I mean, there's a whole tradition of perfect being theology in Western theology and philosophy, and I guess you don't agree with it, or many people don't agree with it, and I guess I do. I think it does make sense to say that an eternal being has a better quality of being than a mortal being. I'm just repeating myself, and from what I said before, the way to measure the degree of being that a being has is to think about whether that being is it limited in its being? Well, is it defective in its being? Well, one way you can be seriously defective in your being is if you're mortal. You don't agree with that? You don't think that that's a flaw in your being, that you are mortal? Your being, your existence is going to stop, at least as a blood creature, right?
Sure, I definitely would prefer to not stop existing, but I don't think that my
Uh-huh.
mortalness is adding to some kind of or detracting for some kind of existing property within me of
Mm.
making me lesser. That seems strange to me. That seems like I have wrinkles on my forehead adds to the property of being Klingon.
Mm.
I don't understand how that works in a sense. So it's
Do you think, I mean, just, health analogy, I mean, do you think that if you have an eye that occasionally doesn't see very well, is that a flaw in your vision?
sure, yeah, because vision we can measure vision as a real thing. That's definitely a property, and it can definitely be influenced by physical harm for sure.
So it's fair to say that someone who's blind has a defect in their vision relative to someone who is not blind, or someone who's partially blind. It's a
Sure. Well, I'm not sure if that would count as a defect because then I can think of animals like octopuses or whatever who can see
Yeah.
extra visions of light. I don't think that we have a
Mhm.
defect in our vision because we don't have that. I definitely we have
Okay.
less vision, but I don't think it's a
Mhm.
defect.
Hmm. Well, I mean, to me, it seems.
Oh, he froze. No. So yeah, Charles did a super chat. Is God bound by his nature or separate from it? Is his nature and himself one? And isn't that a violation of identity? See if we get him back. I'll try to ask those questions. Give him notes so I can copy this down. Don't lose it. And then where was the other one? Why does Pat keep spamming? Can somebody mute Pat? Where was that other super chat? There it is. Hasloy. Who decides what is perfect? If it's God, we only have his word for it. Why believe him? What if perfect is no thing at all? Exactly. Exactly, Halzoy. That is exactly the correct point. Hey, yeah,
I
lost
don't know
connection
what.
there.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there.
Yeah, it seems. I think you lost connection a little bit. It happens. But
But why that happened?
We had a couple super chats come in for you while you
Okay.
were away. So Charles asked, "Is God bound by His nature or separate from it? Are His nature and Himself one? And isn't that a violation of identity?"
Is God bound by his nature? I mean, I would say, in some sense, God is bound by his own nature. Yeah, I agree with that. What was the second question?
Um, are His nature
Is
and Himself one?
I guess so. I'm not sure what the question really is asking. Yeah, I
Well,
think so. And then,
it's a reference to one of my arguments against
uh,
the Euthyphro dilemma. So the Euthyphro dilemma is
uh,
something good because God says it's good, or is it
yeah,
good
yeah.
for some other reason? And then someone says, "Oh, it's God's nature," and then I ask, is God determined by His nature, or does God choose His nature? And if He's determined by His nature, then His choice has no impact on morality. Therefore, His choices, His conscious decisions, and His nature, or His choices have to be determined by His nature.
Yeah, okay, I mean, those raise some good issues, some difficult issues, I think, for theologians or for theists. I mean, I think that God is both necessary and free. So that there's a certain aspect of God's nature that is necessary and fixed, and yet at the same time, God is a free agent. Now that may sound, I don't think that's a contradiction. I think that you might say it's kind of paradoxical that God is both necessary and free. I believe that the traditional notion of in monotheism is that God is both necessary and free, and he chooses to act, and he has in my view, I would say, God has the freedom to not act at all, but God chooses to act in accord with his nature. He's not determined to act by his own nature, but he chooses to act in accord with his own nature. So, for example, God does good things. God is benevolent. He doesn't have to be benevolent, but benevolence is an expression of his nature, a free expression of his nature.
So does that mean God could be evil? He could potentially choose to be evil?
I think so. I know that there are theologians who don't like to say that, but I would rather go on the side of preserving God's freedom. I think God can freely choose to destroy the world, or he can choose not to create the world. But he consistently chooses in accord with his own nature, as an expression of his own nature, he chooses what is best. Um, so he could do evil, but he just chooses not to.
Okay, I think that makes sense. Like then that would be his. Could he choose to change his nature?
I don't not I don't think so.
Is that a contradiction with his freedom, his total freedom?
Well, his freedom is limited. I think theists have to accept that. He can't do whatever the hell. I mean, he can't create round squares. He can't commit suicide completely. I say completely because of my Christian friends who, in some way, think that somehow God died. I don't know. I'm not a Christian, so I'm not going to try to. And I'm sorry if I seem to be flippant about that. But when we speak about God being born and dying, and so that's you'd have to ask a Christian about how to understand that. But I don't think God can destroy himself. I don't think he wants to destroy himself. If I were God, I wouldn't want to. But I don't think he can, even if he wanted to.
That's an interesting position. I have not thought about that before. Definitely have to ask some more theists about their position. Can God destroy himself if he wanted to? That's an interesting topic. So another super chat came in from Halzoy. On being perfect, who decides what is perfect? If it's God, we only have His word for it. Why believe Him? If perfect is nothing at all?
Well, that reminds me a little bit of our conversation we just had a few minutes ago. I mean, I do think that there is a rational non-arbitrary way, at least as far as I'm concerned, to distinguish between what are the, one way of speaking about it is saying what are the God traits? What kind of traits? What are the, if you had to make a list of traits or properties that you think a perfect being would have, what would get on that list? And is there any way of only supporting one list as another list? Right. That's, I think we've spent some time talking about that.
Yeah,
And
yeah. I actually wanted to. Could you give me that methodology? Like, for me, it just seems like the methodology you talked about is which would you imagine is greater. But is there like a more rigorous definition of what the methodology is to establish which criteria would fit this definition?
I mean, I tried to articulate it. It seems like you either disagree or find some flaw, and I respect your opinion on it. It's you have to think about being. We're talking about, if we were to compare two things, two objects in terms of um, which one is the better ashtray or which one is the better comfy chair. Then if that was our standard, then we would say, okay, well, the thing that has some solidity to it is going to be the better ashtray than the thing that just is made out of, you know, paper, right? So the question should be, when we're thinking about God or a perfect being, we have to reflect on being itself. And I think when we do that, we can make rational judgments about what makes one being have a better degree of being than another being. God, I think going back to your questioner's question, um, yeah, it's not just God telling us this is the best, this is right, this is the best, and that's why we think it's the best. There is some rational, objective way of determining, maybe not completely. I think that as a religious believer and as someone who believes in the Torah and the divine revelation, there are certain things that God knows about what is best that we don't know. Okay, but in terms of our conception of what makes one being a better being than another being, I think that, like I said, eternality, freedom, uh, those would be on my list, and I don't think that that's arbitrary. Those would be on my God make God property list.
So to use an example, like why would freedom be greater? Like if we compared karma
Yeah.
or just a field or a quantum field or a karma field of some kind that isn't conscious and said that's the greatest possible being, why would having freedom make one greater?
Because I think, yeah, that's a good question. I think that the reason I think that freedom is a good making trait, so to speak. That's your question, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, I think that, well, part of it has to do with, I think that power, we haven't used that word yet, but I think that a creature, an entity that has power is a better being than an entity that lacks power, all things being equal, because I think that power is an expression of being. If you, that might be hard to articulate or explain. I think that power is an expression of being.
What do you mean by power here? So like my
Mhm.
model is a quantum field has enough energy to create the universe and everything in it. That seems like power. So I think the power in
Right.
all of these would be the same. Oh, I think he froze again. Damn it. Oh, you're back. You're
You're
back.
back, or,
Yep.
or I'm back.
Yep. So yeah, we froze right after I asked why if the
Uh,
power in all three is the same, it seems like, or what do you mean by power?
Well, I was going to say that I think that genuine power is only power of a free being. Genuine power is the ability to choose to do something that's not predetermined by some prior state of yourself. In other words, like you could say, I could say the sun has a lot of power, right? The sun has this great, ball of fire and energy, and it emits these rays that, I don't know, makes the plants grow and gives us, energy to live on this earth. So you could say the sun is a very powerful being, but the truth is the sun isn't choosing to do what it does, right? I don't think the sun has free choice. So in a way, I think a little puny, 10-year-old who has some measure of free choice is more powerful than the sun, because they're choosing to do what they do. So they're more powerful. And power is an expression of one's being. The more limited your power is, the more defective of a being you are.
That seems strange to me. Like, I don't think we have free will. I think we're all determined
Oh, okay.
anyway. But
Okay.
even if we did have free will, I don't see
Mhm.
how that adds to the greatness any more than like my ability to, I don't know, feel hunger. Like I can feel hunger, the sun can't feel hunger. Does that make me greater? I don't think so. I think that's
Mhm.
just a property of biology. So I think that
Right.
I would say that the physics themselves, like the law of gravity, is greater than I am, even though the law of gravity can't feel anything or think anything or choose anything. I don't understand how the choiceness adds to the greaterness of the being. It just seems to be like an emergent property of things that have brains, even if it
Yeah.
exists.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe I confess that I need to think about how to articulate that better. I agree with you that the notion of, I think that power is an expression of one's being in a way that's different from, let's say, just the other properties like the ability to feel hunger, or the fact that you maybe, have hair, or you're green or you're blue or you're white, whatever, the fact that you have feet is not what I would call a great making property of your being. But I do think that free choice is special. But I confess I don't have a good way of articulating that.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely exactly analogous to my question. It's like because it seems to me like that if free will was a thing, it would be a emergent property of the brain, just like feet are, or organs, or color. So yeah, I think that
Mhm.
understanding why we should determine that some properties would be more great making than others, that
Mhm.
criteria I think is the thing that I'm really looking for, and that I haven't found yet from all the theists I've talked to. It seems kind of arbitrary. Like if I said feet were better or something, why is that different from saying choice is better?
Yeah, I mean, maybe one way of articulating it would be to say that freedom is such a special thing, and obviously I do think you have free will, you have free choice, and I think that's what makes you special, as opposed to other things around. I think maybe it has to do with the fact that um, because if we do have free will, and I'm not going to try to argue that we do have free will, but just you working with the concept, an entity that has freedom um, is in some way. I don't know if this would apply to God actually. So, but just thinking about human beings, we have some kind of an ability to create, right? True creative power is only if we are free, right? I mean, does that make sense to you? I guess I'm just using another word, creation. So you're going to ask me to explain what's going on with creativity, but creative power means the ability to genuinely bring something into being that would not have been if you had not made it be, right? So the ability to create, the ability to do new things is a very it's I think it's a special it's a special power that's different from just like other properties that you might have, like having feet or being green. Through your creativity, you're able to actually do things, bring things into being that would not have been there before. Now, of course, if you don't have free will, you can still, like the sun, causes things to happen, but it's just emitting those rays, and it's not really responsible for doing what it does. So I guess maybe it's tied to responsibility, that which of course freedom traditionally responsibility goes hand in hand with freedom. If you're not a free being, then you're not really responsible for your actions, right? Um, but I confess I'm thinking out loud a bit here, about why I think that freedom is a very special power that makes genuine power is only genuine power if it's free, and that is what makes humans special and um, in comparison to other things around. And I think that God, who has a higher level of freedom, is greater in his being because he has freedom. But I confess, I'm thinking out loud here. I don't have this worked out as well as I would like.
Yeah, for sure. So my question is, or my thought process is that if there's something fundamental to reality, does there can be things that emerge from different combinations of what that fundamental thing is, like a quantum field, and that quantum field could produce consciousness or freedom or uh, justice or reliability or all of those different things, but none of those things seem to be entailed in the quantum field. Uh, so even if we have this new property that we're adding to humans or whatever, I don't see any contradiction with saying it's just an emergent thing, and that while it's good, I grant that it's good to have these things. It doesn't seem to follow to infer that this new property that we have that's really nice would be something within the quantum field necessarily, or make the quantum field better to have this thing.
Mm-hmm. Um, okay, I'm not sure I disagree with any of that.
Yeah, yeah. So just my thought process is that if we could just take all of our emergent properties and add them together and say this would make a greatest possible being, one that has the fastest running speed, the fastest flying speed, whatever, just take our emergent properties and add them to things. I don't know if that gives us a reason to believe that there is such a being, because we're just essentially taking properties that we have, which are a result of a long line of evolution or emergent properties or whatever, and then trying to infer that those anthropocentric properties are then within this fundamental thing. And I don't see a connection
Mhm.
between those two claims.
I mean, I wasn't. I'm sorry. Maybe I'm not following. I don't. I wasn't trying to argue that we know that there is such a being.
Oh no, it's more that
I was just trying to articulate the point that it makes sense to think of a being that has freedom as essentially a better being than a being that doesn't.
yeah, yeah. So my question
So,
is um I think the quantum field is the greatest possible being. Now I think
okay.
us having freedom is good too, but if we
Mhm.
take our freedom and add it to the quantum field, does it become better now?
Mm.
And I'm thinking, no, I don't think that makes sense, because to have freedom, from
Mhm.
my sense, freedom is specifically one specific kind of a thing, which is a result of an emergent property of neurons in the brain. Essentially, it is a process created by the brain, like a foot. So adding a foot to the quantum field isn't going to make it any better. Adding a heart to the
Mhm.
quantum field isn't going to make it any better. Those things are emergent properties of other more fundamental things. And so the true greatness isn't this combination, but it's the thing that produces all the combinations. And to me, that seems to be like the quantum field. And so it doesn't need the
Mhm.
freedom to be great,
Could I
because
ask you a question?
sure.
I mean, do you think that a being that is capable of love is better than a being that is not? Like,
Um,
right?
I prefer it, yes. but I don't know if it's objectively better. I definitely prefer though beings capable of love. I don't know, but I don't think it's objectively better.
Hmm. Would you prefer to be, if you could, would you prefer to be in a relationship, a loving relationship with
Sure.
a, a being that is eternal and everlasting than not?
Hmm. Maybe, especially like if I was eternal and everlasting, then absolutely, because I wouldn't want my loved one to die.
Hmm.
But supposing we both had the same lifespan, um, then I don't know. Like I definitely prefer if we were both everlasting. I don't know if
Hmm.
I'm not everlasting, would it make a difference to be in a relationship with someone who's everlasting versus a relationship with someone who's not everlasting? Like I don't know if there's any functional difference between being loving who's someone who can live for 10,000 years versus infinity. I don't know if there's a preference there other than the fact I don't want them to die.
Hmm. I see. Hmm. Well, I don't know, something to think about.
We had
One,
another super
yeah.
chat.
Oh, yes.
So Phaon asks, wouldn't the more complex attributes of being allow an entity to encounter more suffering along with pleasure?
Hmm. Say that again, please.
Wouldn't the more complex attributes of being allow an entity to encounter more suffering along with pleasure? So like it seems like one of the benefits of or one of the great in making properties is its ability to suffer or its ability to do things like lying maybe. And so if it's a truly great being, it would have the ability to suffer and to lie or something like that. And since God is perfect and he can't lie, then God isn't the greatest being, something like that, or suffer.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about, I don't know. Those are good questions. I mean, again, like I said before, I think God can, in my opinion, the way I think of God anyway, God can do, has the freedom to lie and do bad things. Does God have the ability to suffer? I think that there is some, definitely, I think in Jewish theology, certainly in Christian theology, there is some kind of a notion of God's ability to suffer. I think that God can have some of his desires frustrated, and that's painful in some sense, even to God. So I think that God is capable of, in some way, experiencing suffering. I mean, not exactly in the same way that we do, but there is some analogous way in which God does experience and can experience suffering.
Cool. Well, we've been going for about an hour and a half.
Yes.
It's been a great conversation. I really enjoyed having you
Well,
on.
I've enjoyed it too. Your questions have been really good, and they've, prompted me to think more about certain aspects of the argument, of the pragmatic approach.
Definitely, yours have helped me to think of new things too. Like I've never thought to think that to ask Christians if they think God could destroy himself or not. That's an interesting question that I
Hmm.
think is going to be uh, fun to ask certain theists that I know.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I think it was a good conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. And if you want to mention your books or someplace people can find you in case they're interested to learn more about what you said.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I think most relevant to the discussion we had today would be this one, Rationality and Religious Theism, which was published by Ashgate Academic Press back in 2003. So this book is an attempt to uh, work out this it criticizes Pascal's wager, discusses a number of the flaws with the wager, and then tries to articulate this approach of a pragmatic argument in favor of pursuing a religious path, so to speak, and adopting a pragmatic assumption that God exists for the sake of pursuing this religious path. And then the other books were, again, The Conversation. That's a novel, philosophical novel. And for those interested more in Judaism, specifically Jewish Spiritual Path, that might be something that would be interested in Jewish Spiritual Path, the way of the name. So those are the books.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate you taking
Okay.
the time to
Thank
have
you,
a
Tom.
conversation.
Thank you, Tom.